One of our tallest, one of my favorites, the very tall, very wavy St. Regis to the left. This majestic three-part tower is now the third tallest tower in Chicago at nearly 1,200 feet, almost 400 meters, finished in just 2020. But it's now the tallest tower in the world, designed by a woman, Jeanne Gang, who is from Illinois. She's a local Chicago architect, one of the many local architects that we'll learn about today. And I think she's far and away my favorite architect working today in Chicago because her designs are very, very eye-catchingly unique, very one of a kind, such as this one that you're looking at now. And we'll see some more of her work as we keep going. But if you look up at the top of her wavy tower, as the curves accentuate by the color gradient changing, you reach an empty row up there. So that empty row, it is called a blow-through floor. A blow-through floor. How it works is, instead of windows or apartments, you leave this big empty row at the top of your tower so that the wind can blow right through the building, which makes the building absorb less wind, and that will stabilize it or prevent it from having buildings sway in that wind. This is one of three different ways you're going to learn about today of how we may reduce sway here in the Windy City. Now that building cost over $1 billion to build, so it's a pretty luxurious tower. It has about 200 hotel rooms. The hotel opened last year, rooms starting at $700 a night. Has about 400 condominiums. The condos range in price from $1 million for a one-bedroom apartment to a $20.5 million condo that has 4 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, 2 floors. At the top of the middle tower, its own private rooftop pool. That's where I live. But hey, just so you know, there are to this day some unsold condos in that building. So if anybody's in the market here for a cozy spot here in town, think about that lovely curvy tower as an option. And don't worry, I will be pointing out amazing real estate opportunities throughout the tour here today. Now speaking of hotels, on our left is the Swiss Hotel, this metal and glass triangular building here. Now this is a triangular hotel by a guy named Harry Weese. Now Harry Weese, an architect from a few decades ago, who was obsessed with sailing. He really loved to sail, and so he put these nautical triangular sailboat looking shapes into lots of his buildings here in Chicago. So if you spy another triangular building on this tour here, it's going to be this same guy, Harry Weese, the sailing architect. 7 million people living in Chicago, 2.7 million people here, making us still the third largest city by population in the United States. And we have nearly 10 million people who live in the surrounding metropolitan Chicagoland area. So we're just a really big hub here in the Midwest for people to live, to play, and of course also to work. So our first office building is coming up on our right a little bit. It's going to be after the bridge. You're going to have a really unmistakable clock tower at the top, right about below where that sun is. That is the Wrigley Building. The Wrigley Building with that clock tower was built in the early 1920s in 2 separate parts. 1921, the part with the clock tower. 1924, the next door part connected by that little bridge. It's a style of architecture, and we're going to discuss and see lots of different styles today. We have a tremendous diversity of styles from different decades of history on our river. It's what makes our architecture, I think, just really visually dynamic. But this first one here is called Spanish Revival style. Spanish Revival. We call it that because that clock tower up there was modeled after La Giralda. La Giralda is a cathedral in Sevilla, Spain. The top part of this clock tower is similar to the top part of this old cathedral in southern Spain. Now there are 250,000 glazed terracotta tiles, 250,000 of them that you're looking at, of cream and white, that draw your eye towards the top. Now, looking at this beautiful Wrigley building, it is a great example of what we were doing with architecture in the early 1920s in the US, and that was copying all these European styles of architecture. In the early 1920s, the US didn't really have its own identity in architecture yet, so we were still borrowing very frequently from Europe. And it wouldn't be until later on in the 1920s, a couple of years later, that we'd finally get a style that was sort of uniquely our own, this nationwide American brand in architecture. And we'll definitely talk about that style once we see it from the river. But in the meantime, crossing underneath another bridge. This is the Du Sable Bridge here. Now, the Du Sable Bridge is named after Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, the first Chicagoan. I'll tell you about him at the very end of the tour. Crossing underneath arguably the busiest streets. International Hotel and Tower. This is the second tallest tower, second tallest in Chicago, at 1,389 feet. And this is a style of architecture called contextualism. contextualism. So you see those three patios on the building. Now those patios, they all will correspond to heights of neighboring buildings. The first patio corresponds to the roof of the Wrigley building that we just spoke about. That second patio corresponds to the height of that dome building right across the river called the Jewelers Building that we will discuss later. And then the third patio, way up there, corresponds to the height of a black box building that'll be right behind the Trump Tower. You'll sort of see it in just a second. It's a black building called the AMA Plaza. But that's the general idea of contextualism. It is a site-specific design, custom-made for its environment, all about blending in with surroundings, harmonizing with these other buildings around it. Now, it was finished, as I said, in 2009 and designed by Adrian Smith. So Adrian Smith, he's an architect from Chicago who has built the tallest towers in the entire world. And you'll hear more about this guy from Chicago, Adrian Smith, a little bit later. But now on our right is a true local favorite, and certainly a me favorite, the two iconic circular towers coming up here on the right called Marina City. Now you may recognize these circular Marina City towers from any number of TV shows, films, commercials over the years. Anything filming in Chicago loves to feature these uniquely Chicago buildings, which we here at Shoreline Sightseeing often just refer to as the Corncob Towers. You don't know why, big mystery. But in the 1960s when these were built, in the 60s people weren't really living in downtown Chicago. It was industrial down here, a lot of office buildings. And there was an architect from Chicago, Bertrand Goldberg. Bertrand Goldberg wanted to attract people to live downtown. So he built this utopian, vertically stacked world. He built a city within a city, because in Marina City, when those buildings were built, you could have everything you need live above the river. In these buildings, you could find restaurants, shops, a swimming pool, a skating rink, a bowling alley, a movie theater, and of course, at the bottom, parking, a key essential to living in downtown Chicago. If you do own a car down here, hey, parking is precious. Now, I know the idea of a lot of amenities, maybe not totally new for us in 2024, but in the 60s when they were built, the idea of having everything in your apartment building, not having to leave your apartment complex for much of anything, was a very, very new concept. So Bertrand Goldberg sort of pioneered this new form of apartment living. But let's jump across the glass building in the middle there with the panels of white granite. So it's 77 West Wacker, this building on the left. As we get underneath the bridge and you get a chance to look up at the top of the building, you'll see this sort of Greek temple up there. So this is a style of architecture called neoclassical. You take a classical design, so a bit like the Parthenon up there, and you just update it using all these modern materials of glass, steel, granite. The architect of that building, Ricardo Bofill, one of the few international architects on the river from Barcelona, Spain. Now I do want to point out the lovely and very bustling Riverwalk over here on the left. So the Riverwalk here is a relatively new public amenity that zippers together 1.3 miles of Chicago River shoreline, finished in 2016. And it's a great example of some Chicago-style resiliency, because 20 years ago, before they started building the Riverwalk, people could not come down to the river. The river was really not accessible at all. So the city, it invested in the future, beauty, and now you can enjoy the river like never before. As you can see, go for a walk, a jog, walk your dog, have a drink, eat lunch on the steps. So it's become a really big focal point of the downtown experience is the riverfront now, which is really a change for the city from decades past. Now speaking of the river, Chicago is here today. All of us are here today because of this body of water. So the Chicago River is the waterway that connects Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. That is why Chicago was built where it is, because this river, it meets our lake where we started, and then it will continue west via canals or the rivers to the Mississippi. So we were just a huge port here in the US, especially in the 1800s, but late 1800s, one of the busiest ports in all of America. And we have been a center of trade, commerce, transportation, it's it all back just to. Now we're going to jump back into a little bit of a time machine here. I'd say we're going to be in this time machine throughout the whole tour, crisscrossing through different decades, going back to the 1920s, over here on our right, in this enormous building. This is the Merchandise Mart. The Merchandise Mart, coming up on the right, is an iconic style of architecture that I alluded to earlier, Art Deco. This is Art Deco here on the right. It's got all the classic features of that very iconic style. You'll see deep, dark inset windows, the kind of racing stripe vertical lines that draw your eye towards the top. the polished Indiana limestone, giving it that tan or beige color. And then there's always tons of fancy details on Art Deco buildings. So in this case, we can see the gold diamonds at the top and at the bottom, the carved chevrons going east and west. So this was a style for the roaring 1920s, ornate, elegant, ostentatious. If each generation kind of takes their own values and expresses them in 3 dimensions through their architecture, then the merchandise mark, Art Deco, we're expressing the luxury, optimism, hope for the future of the roaring 20s. Which then came to a roaring halt. But we're going to get to that later, because we're about to enter one of my favorite spots on the river, and definitely one of the best photo opportunities on the river. This area, Wolf Point. It is called Wolf Point. It's where you can see nearly 360 degrees of modern glass skyscraper. Let's start here on the left with the Nuveen building, this curvy green building here. So the Nuveen building is another example of contextualism, because you'll notice that the curve in the building mimics the curve here in the river. The blue glass matches the blue of the sky, the turquoise, the green of the river. So that is contextualism as well. You're trying to blend in with the natural context. In this case, it's the beautiful green curving river. And you can see in that reflective glass, the neighborhood being reflected right back at you. By the way, yes, this is a classic image of a train passing over the Lake Street Bridge. L-train, one of our many L-trains, that stands for elevated train, because they are elevated mostly. Straight ahead of us though, giant glass building with this spiraling sculpture in front of it. River Point. Now River Point is an office building from 2017 with those arches up there at the top and at the bottom. I do also call that one the Hot Pocket. Now like I said, 2017, 7 years old, incredibly new. Most of the buildings in this area are really, really new, with one notable exception. Straight ahead, this red building is Fulton House. Fulton House, the red building, our oldest building on the river, from 1898. 1898. Excuse me. It was a cold storage freezing building. It was like a giant refrigerator with barely any windows for the meatpacking industry. Meatpacking, one of our huge industries here in the early 1900s. Our export in Chicago was meat. Chicago was called the hog butcher to the world, the city of broad shoulders, after our very strong meatpacking workers. They would bring all this meat from the south side, freeze it in Fulton House there, ship it across the country on trains like the ones that used to run on the Upraised Bridge. This is the Carroll Avenue from 1908, a historical landmark permanently raised in this position. And it shows you how bridges in Chicago work. So that big piece of concrete right there, that big piece of concrete swings down, letting the top part of the bridge to lower. You raise it back to where it is now. It counterweights the bridge into the air, working like a seesaw called a trunnion bascule bridge, or a Chicago-style bridge. And if it were to lower, it would reach the river cottages to our left. Now these unique river cottages, you'll notice, have this triangular design, and porthole windows might remind you a bit of a sailboat. That's because that's another design by Harry Weiss. Harry Weiss, again, that architect who loved to sail. And when he built these cottages though, in the late 80s, people thought he was crazy, but not really for the design. See, back in the 80s, no one really wanted to live on the north branch of the river we are on now. The north branch here, like much of the river, used to be quite industrial, smelly, literally smelly, pretty gross. And people did not really want to be down here. And you can see this sort of old attitude from the river over here on the right in the East Bank Club. So the East Bank Club here is a nice fitness club, a gym. But you'll notice it looks like you're looking at the back of a building, and that is because you are. It's almost like it's treating the river as an alleyway, kind of turning its back on the river. But that was the old attitude. No one wanted to look at the river, let alone live on it. But as you can see, over on the left, there are beautiful condos, beautiful townhomes down here now. There are definitely a lot of people who would like to live on the river. So our river here really has kind of bounced back in this sort of beautifying way 10 years ago. For example, to our left here, you've got this big high-rise condo building, Wolf Point West, from just a few years ago. Then next door, you got Salesforce Tower office building, then another condo building, Wolf Point East. None of these three skyscrapers were here 8 years ago. It was a big parking lot. So it's sort of a microcosm of Chicago in that way, how quickly things here feel like they're always evolving, always changing. I think that's true even for people who live here. They come back to downtown after maybe not spending a lot of time there for a while. It's like they're seeing a whole new place. More on this later. But speaking of new buildings, in front of us we have this giant glass building with that Y-shaped base. Kind of looks like a big pencil stuck into the ground. That is 150 North Riverside. 150 North Riverside from 2017 as well. Now it has that unique base shape for two reasons. Number one, so that the building's caissons, basically the foundations of the building, that they're not interfering with the Metro and Amtrak train lines running right underneath the building, right by the building, underneath the ground. And then number two, the city does have a rule these days for a 30-foot setback to be left for a river walk. For all these new buildings getting built on the river, they all need to leave space for a pathway. Really important to us in Chicago to keep our waterways, the river, the lake, clear for pedestrians, for everyone to enjoy, as you can see on all sides of us, all these river walks. So that's how we end up with such a specific design. The base though, only 39 feet wide. It's about 13 meters wide, pretty narrow, and it's pretty tall. So we're gonna deal again with sway. Now to bring down the sway in this tower, inside the top, just imagine, inside the top, 160,000 gallons of water, several million liters of water in 12 big tanks. And so what happens is when the building starts to sway in one direction, all of the water, it just goes, sloshes in the opposite direction to correct for the sway. It's this big water shock absorber. The inertia creates this balancing liquid force that brings the building back to rest really quickly, reducing the sway, and that way it also reduces nausea, which is really important. You know, no one wants to get seasick at the top of a really fancy office tower. No fun, not good for productivity. So we always got to reduce sway. You're going to learn another way to do it in our tallest tower a little bit later. Now that building of 150 North Riverside, designed by the Gesch Partners. And a couple years later, they also designed this one on our left, the Bank of America building. The Bank of America building to our left is one of our newest. It's from only 2020. Now they also had to deal with that 30-foot setback for the Riverwalk requirement. And they did so in a pretty creative way. They used these big tripods, these tripod legs, that are just kind of vaulting the building by that third floor, which maximizes all the office space above it and still allows for a beautiful pathway. So, really great example of the constant compromise happening between design and urban planning. So the architects, the developers, they want one thing for the lot. The city may want something different. They have to meet somewhere in the middle. I think the outcome of that is often just very interesting architecture that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise, that adds to the flavor of the river. So, you know, hey, for once, yay, compromise. But, jumping back into our time machine, the next 5 buildings on the right, were all built in chronological order. So they really demonstrate the evolution of architecture here in Chicago. So first up on our right, this is going to be 2 Riverside Plaza. 2 Riverside, another really good example of the Art Deco style. So you'll see the deep dark windows, these sort of racing striped lines, the Indiana limestone, that's the tan color. You can see elaborate carvings at the bottom, Clocks Plaza. Again, it's the roaring 20s. Oh, what happened? In 1929, the stock market, boom, it crashed. And we entered the Great Depression, and there was a freeze on the building of office buildings from 1930 to 1957. So over 25 years of no building towers in Chicago. But when we kind of restart architecture in the late 50s and 60s, we jump into black box modernism, which you can see over here on our right in Gateway Centers 1 and 2, black box modernism. Now the father of this boring, minimalist style of architecture was a man named Mies van der Rohe. So Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, he was a really famous German architect. He then moved over here to Chicago around World War II, and he said that less is more. Less is more. So I think there's a bit of an elegant simplicity to black boxes. Dark, stark, they're more cheap, they're easier to make. These buildings, I would say, are more functionally beautiful instead of being all that aesthetically beautiful, right? But hey, why'd they build like that? How do we go from some fancy, expensive Art Deco style to simple boxes? Well, again, this was the post-Great Depression generation, post-World War II generation. People who were pretty thrifty, who were concerned, hey, there could be another financial crash someday, so let's maybe not spend all our money on gold and statues, carvings on buildings. Let's keep it simple, keep the costs low, and that's how they built over 60 of these black boxes, these little black boxes in just Chicago alone, in a period of only about 15 years. But let us now disco on to the groovy 1970s with the international style of Gateway Center 3, this white building on the right. So in the 70s, all right, architects, they're starting to go crazy. They can't think of what they can do next, so they jump out and do white boxes. So we go from black boxes to white boxes. So not very different, but there is a little more ornamentation. There's stone cladding on the building sometimes, etc. So a little fancier. Now we call this white box style though international style, because you can see a building like this being built really anywhere in the world in the 1970s, perhaps even in your hometown. But now let us moonwalk to one of my favorite decades of architecture, the 1980s, with Gateway Center 4, this curvy glass building on the right. So I love the 80s because things went in a whole new direction. You know, architects were tired of boxes. They thought modernism maybe kind of boring. They wanted something with some personality again. Thus, this contextualism style begins to emerge. You'll notice that the curve in the building, mimicking again the upcoming curve in the river. Darker green glass matching the color. The convex windows are reflecting sort of the ripple effect of water in the river. So again, all about building a building that's going to fit best in this exact location. But back to black boxes. On our left, simple black box building that we did not used to talk about much on tours, and I think that made the owners a little sad. So they spent over $800,000 to put themselves on the map. This to your left is a huge "You Are Here" map of the Chicago River. And that little red block up there represents this building on the river. So we went west down the main branch, we turned north into the north branch, we did the turnaround, came here, and we have reached this building. So hey, next time anybody's lost in downtown Chicago, drop your phone in the river, just look at that building. You'll know exactly where to go. Not a single street name on it, very helpful. But on our right is another massive Art Deco building, Art Deco again, which you might recognize if you are a big Batman fan, because this is where Heath Ledger's Joker robbed a Gotham City bank in a 2008 film, The Dark Knight. If anyone remembers The Dark Knight, the Joker drives this big school bus full of stolen money straight out of the building in the opening scene of the film after murdering all his henchmen that helped him do the heist in the first place. Spoiler alert, sorry. But before that, this was the old post office. Yes, when this building was built almost 100 years ago, the largest post office in the world. Now, if you're asking yourselves, well, why? Why did Chicago need such a big post office? Well, before Amazon, before the invention of online shopping, Chicago was the mail order and catalog capital of the world. We had the likes of Sears department store here, among others, and we needed such a massive post office to handle such an intense high volume of mail. But it's not a post office anymore, hasn't been for a while. They turned it into an office building a couple of years ago. Now it's big headquarters for big companies, Uber, Walgreens, PepsiCo, just to name a few. Now, in talking about the Great Fire of 1871, there's a lot of myth surrounding the fire, so we need to first separate the facts from the fiction. So I would like to start with the fiction. Okay, the following is the not true story. Okay, this is the untrue story. This is the myth of the fire, the legend of the fire. Perhaps some of you have heard. It goes like this. In 1871, they say that a cow in Mrs. O'Leary's barn, so this legend goes, that Mrs. O'Leary was milking her cow, as she often did, but that on this particular evening, the cow got really upset. And that the cow just sort of kicked over this kerosene lantern, big lantern she was holding, which started the whole barn on fire. And then soon they say, in a matter of hours, that the whole city of Chicago was ablaze, all from the kick of a single cow. Now, maybe that story is familiar to some people here. Maybe somewhere in your life you may have heard of a cow starting this fire in Chicago. You know, the story of the cow, it's definitely gotten around over the years, probably because they used to teach it in schools, but it is untrue. Now, it gets confusing because there are a few things that are true about the story. Number one, Mrs. O'Leary is a real person. So her name is Catherine O'Leary. She's an Irish immigrant, and she has a barn in Chicago in 1871. And number two, it is notable that she had a cow. And number three, we do actually think the fire started in her barn. But listen, there is no proof, there is no evidence whatsoever to blame it on the cow or blame it on poor Mrs. O'Leary or anyone else for that matter. We don't know. We don't know how the fire actually began, and we never will. But the city of Chicago, you know, they did They officially exonerated Mrs. O'Leary and her cow very swiftly in 1997. So, yeah, only took 125 years, but they did. They cleared her name. Now here are the facts of the fire that we know. So in the mid-1800s, Chicago's population here is exploding with industrialization, all these new jobs. So the city is founded officially incorporated 1837. In 1837, there are 4,000 people here. By 1900, over 1 million. And our building of new buildings is trying to keep up with all this population growth, but the problem was we were building everything here out of wood. And not just the buildings, the streets, the sidewalks, really everything was made of wood, and it had been a really, really dry summer. So, around 9 p.m. on October 8th, 1871, a fire started in this barn, located only about a mile to the right on the west side of the river. Now that fire, it burned over the course of 3 days. It destroyed over 18,000 buildings, left over 100,000 people, about a third of the population without homes, and tragically killed about 300 people. 3.5 square miles of the city burnt to the ground, the largest urban fire ever at that time. High winds in the Windy City, they created these fire tornadoes, these cyclones of flame that jumped across the Chicago River twice, lighting it, the river itself, on fire. How did the river light on fire? It was so polluted at the time from the meatpacking industry, sort of just dumping everything into the river that they didn't want. It lit the river on fire. Big disaster, headline news across the world. But remember how I told you that Chicago is resilient? That fire was far and away the worst, and yet also the best thing to ever happen to Chicago, because it meant that the city had to fully reinvent itself from scratch. Architects, they came to Chicago from across the country after this fire, and they learned from Chicago's mistakes. They started to build out of steel frames instead of wood. The rebuilding started the next day after the fire and did not look back. Within 15 years, a man named William LeBaron Jenney, he built the first ever steel frame skyscraper, the first kind of modern skyscraper ever. He built it here in Chicago. So as we turn around here and get a really cool view of some very cool buildings downtown, one in particular, we can all think about how Chicago wouldn't have the same grid system it has today, the organized grid system of streets that comes from the rebuild. Chicago wouldn't have the same lakefront it has today because all the debris from the fire was used to build out the lakefront into what it is now. Chicago wouldn't have been developed in the ways that it was downtown because all of the architects that attracted after the fire, which fueled more population growth, brought more business to the city, led to even more buildings and people and buildings and business and so on and so forth. In short, Chicago would not be the same city that it is today. It would not look the way it does to us right now without this fateful fire. Okay, so just a couple of decades after this fire, 22 years later, Chicago has now rebuilt itself. It feels amazing. Wants to show off to the whole world. New year, new me. And they get to host the 1893 World's Fair. Now, this fair, held in Jackson Park, a beautiful park on the south side, was called the White City, because over 200 buildings built for the fair, and they were all painted white to look like Italy, Venice, Italy, the theme of the fair. Where for 6 months, 27 million people came to visit. 27 million visitors. And they came to do things. They came to ride the first ever Ferris wheel, to eat new foods like Cracker Jacks, Juicy Fruit Gum, the Brownie, to drink a new beer called Pabst, later Pabst Blue Ribbon, to see inventions like spray paint, the dishwasher, and even the zipper. I mean, wow, where would we be without the zipper? But I think the real important part about this fair is that all of those millions of people, 27 million people, they leave, they go home across the country and the world after the fair talking about this beautiful, now rebuilt city called Chicago here in the middle of the U.S. on the lake. So it really kind of put Chicago on the map for the first time as a sort of world-class city that people start to know about across the globe. Speaking of world class, so this building on your right looks familiar to you. You might be reminded a bit of Marina City. Those were the corntop towers. That's because this is its sister building. This is called River City. River City is another circular building made out of concrete where you can have all you need, live above the river. There's a big child care facility on the first floor, which is an amazing amenity. There's a lovely marina for your personal boat right underneath the building here. Really nice in the summertime. You can be like this guy. Just take a little boat, zip for the river, go to Lake Michigan, come back to the river at night, go up to your apartment. Amazing. A lot of people in Chicago, never been a single one, but hey, one day. And that building, again, also designed by Bertrand Goldberg from Chicago. from the 80s. But we have now reached the Chicago royal family. So we have in front of us the Queen, the Sears, or the Willis Tower. That very tall black box building with the big white antennas. And then we have the Princess, 311 South Wacker, that pink granite octagonal building with the large sort of crown-looking barrel at the top. And then we'll have the Lady, the Chicago Board of Trade building, over there on the right with the beautiful statue. Let's start on the right with the statue. So that's the Chicago Board of Trade building, another really good example you'll see of Art Deco. You can see again, same features, deep dark windows, that sort of racing striped vertical lines, the Indiana limestone tan color, and those lines leading you up to that big statue. So the statue up there is of Ceres. Ceres, the Roman goddess of grain, Roman goddess of agriculture. Ceres is on top of there because they used to trade grain futures on the floor of the building, agricultural commodities. And if you go inside the building, which I'd recommend because you can, you'll see amazing Art Deco interior design. These golden husks of corn, these soaring shafts of wheat. It's sort of like if Great Gatsby meant farming. It's very cool. And then in front of us, we have the Princess, 311 South Wacker, that pink building ahead with the big barrel. Now that, look, we Chicago, hey, we love birds. And we always learn from our mistakes. So nowadays, we do dim the lights on that building, and actually every single building in Chicago, to allow birds safe travels during their migration seasons. It's very Midwestern nice of us. But, enough about birds, we've now reached the one,
the only, the tallest tower in Chicago, straight ahead, the Sears or Willis Tower. So,
let us rewind to 1973. In 1973, Sears department store builds the tallest building in the world at the time. Here in the Windy City, you're gonna deal again with sway. So to bring down the sway in the tower, they simply built 9 of them. They built 9 towers in one single tower. The concept is called bundled tubes. Let me show you how this works. So on our left here, you can see that shorter tower, and then it goes up in the center to a taller tower, back down on the right to a shorter tower, back up to a taller tower, and so on. You can see it's sort of spiraling upward to these 2 tallest towers. And that relatively simple design braces the building against the wind. Now that design concept, bundled tubes, Fazlur Khan, a structural engineer from what is today Bangladesh. And that made that the tallest tower in the world for 25 years at 1,451 feet, 442 meters, 110 floors. Tallest tower on the planet for about 25 years. Now currently the tallest tower in the world is called the Burj Khalifa, in Dubai. Now the Burj Khalifa in Dubai stands at over 2,700 feet tall, over 800 meters tall, nearly 2 Sears towers stacked on top of each other.
That's crazy.
It's pretty tall. But you've never seen it before, never seen it. The Burj Khalifa, it actually looks a lot like the Trump Tower in Chicago. It's got the same spiral design. It's just double the size. It was designed by the same architect, Adrian Smith, who is from Chicago, full circle. So that's why in Chicago, you know, we can say that while we no longer have the world's tallest tower, we do still have the world's tallest architect. Very cool. He's actually 5'7". Now, the Sears Tower, the Willis Tower, Ricky, you're saying 2 different names, and that is confusing. Well, to clear up this confusion, Sears left the building in the 90s, and then Willis, an insurance brokerage firm in the building, started renting the naming rights in 2009, which is why for the last 15 years, that has been technically called the Willis Tower. But, you know, Chicagoans very stubborn, very nostalgic. If you ask a true lifelong Chicagoan, hey, what's the name of your tallest tower? They're probably gonna yell at you that is the Sears Tower. Sears Tower. I picked this other name. But again, in case that's confusing, Sears and Willis in the building. Now you can go up to the top, by the way, if you didn't know that, you can go up to the sky deck in the Sears Tower. Amazing views of the whole city. Highly recommend it for all ages. Really good educational information as well. But whenever I'm up in the sky deck, which I try to go once a year, I always think about the fact that the building has been climbed 2 times. So the first person who climbed it was an American. His name was Dan Goodwin. Dan Goodwin climbed it wearing a Spider-Man costume, and he used little suction cups. And the second was a guy from France, his name Alain Robert, who climbed the Sears Tower using nothing. No equipment. He was called free soloed the face of the Sears Tower with his bare hands. He used just the window ledges, and he did this in a little over 1 hour.